Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. So seeing my title on the screen, I know what some of you are probably thinking, and I'm going to ask that you please refrain from throwing tomatoes, at least until the end of the presentation. I think we're going to be friends by then, so you might not want to throw tomatoes. Before I begin, I have to tell you that I work with an awesome team of engineers, some of who are sitting toward the front of the room. These guys have been working really hard to build everything that we'll talk about today. We call ourselves Team Argonne, and you'll see a bunch of us with this logo on our shirts this week. And there's quite a few different cool reasons why this became our logo, and if you see any of them, feel free to ask them, and they can choose whichever reasons they want to share with you. But the main reason is that it's a patch. Get it? Argonne. So just a quick look at what we'll talk about today. So first I want to give you a quick intro to Jamf patch management. And then we'll take a look at what a patch management workflow actually looks like using the features that we released in 9.9.3, as well as some of the features that are coming in Jamf Pro 10. And then I don't dare get into Q&A without first talking about our future plans beyond even what we'll demo for Jamf Pro 10. So we'll get into that. And then finally, like Joe said, we'll get into Q&A, and you guys can use the JNUC 2016 patch hashtag to tweet questions throughout the session, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can at the end. So I know I've talked to probably many of you in the audience about patch management, and I know that some of you are probably also using the functionality that we released in 9.9.3 around patch management. But I do just want to start by getting us all on the same page and giving you a quick intro to Jamf patch management. So what do we mean when we say patch management? We really just mean keeping the software in your environment up to date, but that can be a lot more complicated than it sounds. So at the center of this all, you're having to constantly keep your eye on the versions that are installed in your environment and which computers are on which versions. And you're also having to constantly keep your eye out for new patches that might be available for deployment. So once you identify a patch that's available for deployment, you typically have to package that up, upload it to the correct distribution points for installation, and then finally install that patch. And that last step is where things can get pretty tricky depending on the patch. And the kicker to all of this is that many of you are doing this for dozens of software titles, and that even might be putting it modestly. And many of these titles are coming out with updates as frequently as once or twice a month or even more. So this is a lot for you guys to keep up with, and we know that. So because this is such a repetitive and time-consuming process, I've actually talked to quite a few people who have just stopped patching. They either don't have... It's true. I've talked to people that just say, I'll ask them, how do you do patch management? And they'll say, well, I just kind of don't. We just let users take care of it on their own. And I can totally see how someone could get to this point because it is so time-consuming, but I do not recommend it, especially for security-minded organizations. So Gartner tells us that through 2020, 99% of exploited vulnerabilities will be ones that we've known about for at least a year. So reading between the lines a little bit, what that tells me is that many security issues can be prevented by just basic patching. So it's really important that we do this. And then security concerns aside, it's also just a best practice to keep the software in your environment up to date because it keeps your users productive. So this stuff is pretty important. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. So what is Jamf doing about this? What's our approach? We touched on this a little bit in the keynote, but what I really want to drive home today is that we're taking a very iterative approach to this. So if you asked, I guess it's a pretty complicated set of problems, and so we're trying to take it one step at a time and get a lot of feedback along the way. I mentioned that I've talked to many of you in the audience about patch, and I think I've talked to upwards of 60 or 70 different users throughout the last couple of years to get feedback. So as you saw with 9.9.3, we started off by releasing some functionality around patch reporting and notifications. And this is, like we said, just the beginning, but this is really going to be the framework of the entire solution that drives the whole thing. And then we'll talk more about Jamf Pro 10. With Jamf Pro 10, we're planning to deliver a patch deployment solution that's really purpose-built just for the purpose of patching for the first time ever. And then we'll talk about this more later, but we do plan to continue this journey beyond Jamf Pro 10. The other thing I wanted to get across today is that if we asked 100 different Mac admins to describe their ideal patching solution, we would get about 99 different answers. And I know that because I have asked about 100 different Mac admins. And so we really want to start off by focusing on the most common needs. And we also want to focus on keeping this simple, not making this thing super complicated. Especially in these early stages, I think as the solution matures, we will have room to grow and to meet some of those less common needs. But for right now, we're really in this stage of trying to find the lowest common denominator between those 100 Mac admins and meet those needs really well. So in that spirit of really starting to focus on the most common problems first, we've started off by looking at third-party software titles, because that's what we've been hearing from you guys, that's the biggest pain point for the most people. So we started off by asking a bunch of you to tell us the titles that are taking up the most of your time to keep patched, and we came up with a list of about 30 titles. So as you can see, we've got support for many Adobe and Microsoft titles, as well as a couple of common web browsers, common antivirus titles, just about every flavor of Java that you can think of, and Skype. And many of you are probably wondering, where are the Apple titles? Where are the Apple operating systems and the security updates and the App Store apps coming from Apple? And we'll talk about that more at the end, but we do plan to add support for that in the future. So I promised that was the most boring part of my presentation, and we'll get to what you all came for, starting with a demo, but I do have to start with a disclaimer. As you saw in the keynote, we have a lot going on in our engineering team, and the JSS that I'm not supposed to say JSS. See, Dean said, it's simple, but it's hard at the same time. The Jamf Pro that we'll be looking at today is actually coming right from the unreleased stream of code that our engineers are working on. And so you will see some things that are a little unfinished, and I promise you that it's an organized mess, and we know about these unfinished things, and we are working on them. This is pre-beta software that we're looking at here. And this is actually kind of cool because there's no smoke and mirrors. This is all working software. As Dean said, it's also kind of risky, so bear with me, pray to the demo gods. I was making updates to my demo environment as late as 4 p.m. today to include the code that's coming right from our engineers. So with that, with my many disclaimers, we'll get into demo. So let's start off by talking about the process that you would go through to set up patch management for software titles. We can see that I've already navigated to the Computers tab and then the patch management link in the sidebar. And we'll go ahead and click New to set up a new title. And I'll pick PowerPoint for this example. So pretty much all we have to do here is choose the way that we want to get our notifications when there's a new update available for PowerPoint. So we can either get those right within, it says JSS right here, right within Jamf Pro, or we have some work to do here, or via email, or both. And that's really the main thing that you have to do. You might want to add it to a category, but really other than that, we can go ahead and click Save, and we've set up patch management for Microsoft PowerPoint. We'll take a look at one other setup example. This time we will go with Adobe Flash Player. So here we can see we have this additional tab that we did not have before called Extension Attributes. And if we click this tab, we can see that it's telling us this tab is there because Flash is not something that we collect by default with the default inventory collection. And this is because Flash is not a true application. It's actually a plugin. And we need inventory information about these titles to drive both our reporting and our scoping. So in order to do that for Flash, we actually need to use an extension attribute. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with extension attributes. Essentially, we'll just be running a script on managed machines to collect this information. So below, we can take a look at the script and go ahead and accept that. And that's pretty much all there is to setting up patch titles. So once we have patch management set up for our different titles that we have added, what features do we get? And this process really starts out with Jamf identifying patches and then making them available to you. We currently have a target response time of 48 hours for this. You'll notice that we often have them available within 24 hours. And I know this is a point of contention with a lot of people, so I will say that we are working hard to decrease the amount of time that it takes us to release these. But I do also want to make sure that everyone understands that the reason that there's a delay in this is that we're actually testing the titles before making them available to you. So that's kind of a patch management best practice, is to test these out before deploying them. And so we're taking some of the work for that off of your shoulders and doing that ourselves. I won't get into detail now about what exactly we're testing, because there's actually an expert session later today at 4 o'clock with our engineers, and they'll get a little more into the weeds on what we're testing. They're laughing because I'm plugging their session and they're nervous. So once the patch is available, we can see that we get a notification in the way that we chose when we set up the title. So here I'm getting it in the JSS, and we can see the version of Chrome that's available as well as when it was published by Jamf. And this functionality was available in 9.9.3 like we talked about, but it does have the new styles of Jamf Pro 10. And this really saves you guys time so that you're not having to go out and search for updates. We're bringing that information right to you. So the nice thing here is that we can go ahead and click into this notification and be brought right to Google Chrome. And let's take a look at the report for Chrome. So here, just from setting up Chrome as a title like we just did, we get this automatically, nicely styled, generated report that didn't require any complicated smart groups or anything. This is just right out of the box when I add Chrome. So what we get here is we get a quick look at how we're doing against the latest version. In this case, we're not doing so hot because it just came out and we haven't had a chance to patch it. So in a minute, we'll take a look at how to improve those numbers. And we can also take a little bit deeper dive if we scroll down here to this table. And we can see that the versions that are installed in our environment and the distribution of all the different devices that are on those versions. And we can get into even further detail in the right table over here. We can see a full list of all the computers that have Chrome installed and some information about each of them. And we touched on this a little bit in the keynote, but I do want to just call out that this table has some nice new functionality in Jamf Pro 10 that was not available before. We can actually filter any of the columns or resize them. We can customize the columns that are displayed here, because I know different people want to see different information about the devices that are displayed here. And all of this is remembered per user. So if I care about different inventory information than my coworker, he can set it up his way, I can set it up my way, and it will remember that when I come back in here. So now that we know that there's a patch available, if we think back to that circular diagram of all the steps involved with patch management, the next step would be to package this up and get it onto a distribution point. So I'm going to switch over here to settings. And again, we see the nice new Jamf Pro 10 look. And I'm going to navigate to packages. And here we can see I've already created a package for the latest version of Chrome, and I've uploaded it to my distribution points, and we can see that it's available in the JSS. So this is something that we'll be working hard to automate in the future, and we'll talk about that more at the end of the presentation. But for right now, it's just the typical process that you guys are used to with packaging it up using a tool like Composer, and then getting it onto your distribution points and in the JSS using something like Casper Admin. So we'll switch back to patch management, and we're going to take a look at the definition tab. So here, what we need to do is actually associate that package with the correct version in the definition. And so we'll go ahead and click Edit. And then when we click Add, we get a similar list to what we just saw in the Packages area of the JSS. So we just have all of the packages that are available for us on our distribution points. So I'll pick the latest Chrome package that I created and uploaded, and we'll hit Save. And just like that, we're ready to deploy this thing. So this is where we get into patch policies. And this is the part that starts to get me excited, because this is the new big thing that will be coming in Jamf Pro 10. So patch policies is obviously the way that we'll be using, the feature that we'll be using to actually deliver these patches to end users. And we call them patch policies because they really are similar in concept to the regular policy engine that you guys are all used to. They're deployable, you can configure the scope, and you can configure exactly how it gets deployed to your users. There's a couple key differences, though, between policies and patch policies. Patch policies, like I said, are purpose-built just for patch management. So they're not going to be cluttered up with anything that is completely unrelated to patch management. I like to think of regular policies as sort of a Swiss Army knife. You can do a lot of things with them, but that can get problematic when you're talking about patches because there's so much there that really does not apply to patch management. And then the other cool thing is the things that you do need for patch management are much easier and more automated. So here I have 2 pre-created patch policies. I have one for my test group. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this type of workflow of first deploying this patch out to a small test group to make sure that it doesn't blow anything up or break anything for your users. And then depending on the organization, there's different numbers of test groups that you would go through before deploying this out to everyone in production. So here I just have a simple workflow of one test patch policy and then a production patch policy. And we can see the logs actually from the last time that I deployed Chrome to these groups. So we'll go ahead and take a look at our test patch policy. So here we can see the previous version of Chrome that I deployed to this group. And we can see just a little bit of information about that version. And we can see that it's set to be installed on these computers automatically. And we're going to leave this here because this is our test group, and so we want to get this out into testing as soon as possible. We are going to go ahead and update this target version to the one that I just created and assigned the package for. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at the scope tab. You'll notice that the scope tab looks a little bit different than you guys are used to seeing. And no, I'm not talking about the giant buttons. We know that needs work. I'm talking about the way that it's split into 2 main sections. So this first section is eligible computers or devices. So what this is an automatically generated list of computers that are eligible for this patch. So computers that have Chrome installed that are not on the version that I just targeted and that meet all of the requirements to actually install Chrome. So you guys are accustomed to writing or creating complex smart groups to do this, and you're having to maintain them every time new patches come out. But right here, the JSS is really doing the heavy lifting for you because our engineers are awesome. But in this case, because this is a test group, we don't actually want to deploy this to every single eligible computer. So we can go over here to the refinement tab, and here's where it starts to look a little bit more familiar other than the giant buttons. You get the usual targets and limitations and exclusion options that you're used to seeing in scope. So what we can see here is that I have this targeted towards a smart group that I created of all my test machines. So these are machines that belong to users that have signed up to be my guinea pigs for new versions. And the nice thing is, it's not a problem here if some of them are not Chrome users and there's not Chrome installed, because that's what our eligible devices tab is taking care of for us. So we'll go ahead and save this patch policy. Ooh, pre-beta software people. Okay, so let's say that went well, our test stage went well. That's okay, I wasn't going to show that much detail in that one anyways. What we'll really look at is the production one. So say we pushed it out to our test group, it went well. We went 5 days, which is our standard time, without hearing any complaints from users about things breaking. So we've decided that it's safe to go ahead and push this out to everyone with our production patch policy. So we'll take a look at this one, and we have a similar setup here where we can see the previous version that was deployed, and again, we'll go ahead and update that with the latest version. And this time I do want to point out that it's telling us that this version actually requires Chrome to be closed before the app can be fully updated. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. And this patch policy I actually have set to be made available in self-service. This is a much broader group of users, and so we want the user experience to be a little bit nicer and less forceful with them. So again, we'll look at the scope tab, and the JSS is doing the same handy thing where it's auto-calculating all of the devices that would be eligible for this patch. And because this is our production patch policy, we'll go ahead and leave the target set to all computers. And then we'll take a look at how this gets configured for our end users in self-service. So here you get a couple options that will look familiar to those of you who are used to deploying things in self-service. You can customize the button name and the description that's displayed to users. One thing that's a little bit new is that you can display notifications for the patch policy in self-service. So I've chosen to display them in self-service, and I've given it a custom subject and message. So this is helpful because if you have users that are not proactively going out to self-service to look for new things, this will alert them that there's something new. And the other cool thing we get here is the ability to configure a deadline. And those of you that are familiar with a similar feature that we have in policies will be excited to know that this deadline is actually not a hard date. This is just an amount of time since the patch was first made available to the users. So the reason that people are clapping and this is cool is because it's the type of thing you can set it once and forget. So you don't have to be coming in here constantly and updating this date. And it also doesn't really matter what time zone your users are in because it's an amount of time and not a time. And then finally, like usual, we can give it a custom icon for the user so that it looks familiar to them. So this one we're going to save, and it's going to work. And it did. And we can see that our logs already switched all these computers to pending. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like for the end users in self-service. We saw a kind of a sneak peek of this in the keynote, but we'll go a little bit deeper here this time. So we're going to open up our fancy new self-service app. Ooh. And like Drew showed, the app is responsive, so I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger for you guys to see. And one of the first things you'll notice is that there is a badge in both the app icon in the dock as well as up here on our Updates tab. So kind of similar to that notification that we set to tell users that there's a patch available, this is another way to kind of remind them, hey, there's stuff here for you to do. You have a little to-do list. And I don't know about you guys, but myself and a lot of Apple users that I know, the badge is really annoying. Like, you have to get it away. So hopefully that will encourage users to actually install this. And then our notification didn't work because the demo gods didn't like me, but you saw in the keynote that we would get a notification as well to remind them that there's something new. So let's go ahead and take a look at the patch. So we can see here that it has all of the information that we configured with patch policies in the JSS, including our deadline. So the deadline actually gets translated into a date for the user. So they can see that they have until October 25th to install this thing, or else IT is just going to go ahead and do it. And we'll go ahead and click Update and see what happens here. Remember in the JSS when we were configuring this patch policy, I told you to take note that the JSS was telling us Chrome has to be closed before this can be fully updated. So we can see that I have Chrome open down here in the dock. And what self-service has done is it's detected that I have this open, and so it's telling me to close Chrome. So I'm going to go ahead and be cooperative with self-service here and close Chrome. And let's try this one more time. Cool. So this time we can see it's detected that I've played nice and closed the app, and it's actually going ahead and updating Chrome. And again, we get nice feedback here right in the button that it tells the user what's going on. So one of the things that is a little bit complicated for IT to deploy patches is, oh, and we can see that this finished, and it disappeared from our list. So we got rid of one of our badges, and the user's happy because they crossed an item off of their to-do list. But as I was saying, one of the things that makes patch management complicated for IT is this having to deal with patches that require user interaction, like we saw here with Chrome being open, or sometimes patches will require a computer restart. I know a lot of people that try to predict when is going to be a good time for users to do this, but it's impossible. You guys know this. It's impossible. We don't want to interrupt them in the middle of an important presentation or a meeting with a patch that requires an app to be closed or a restart. So we really think that self-service is the best end-user experience that gives the user the control to say when is a good time to do these things so that you don't have to be guessing. But at the same time, one of the things that also makes patch hard is that IT ultimately has to have that control to make sure it gets done in a timely manner. If we just willy-nilly put patches in self-service and expect our users to take care of it, we know that that doesn't always happen. So that's where we get into things like the in-your-face badge, and the notification in the notification menu, and then ultimately that deadline that we can enforce. So that strikes a good balance between giving the end user some control over the best time to do this, but also giving IT the ultimate control to say, you have to do this by a certain date. And that's what we have for the demo for patch management. So we'll switch back to our presentation. Maybe. Thank you. Okay, so now we'll get into some more good stuff, and we'll talk about some of our future plans beyond what you just saw in Jamf Pro 10. And before I bring up a list, I have to start off by saying I do not have any dates that I can share with you at this time. I would share more if I could, but we just don't know yet. So as we talked about, we definitely have some time that we need to spend on automating this process for creating these packages and getting them onto your distribution points. We know that that's a huge time commitment for you guys, and that's a big part of the problem that we have not solved yet, and we do plan to solve that. We don't have a ton of details right now about how this will work because we haven't built anything yet, but we're getting there. What I can share now is that we know that we do not want to get into the business of building these packages ourselves and creating them and distributing them to you. So instead, what we plan to do is to build a tool that you guys can install in your environment that can follow instructions in these definitions to build the packages automatically in your environment. And we'll share more on that when we know more. And then once we have that package creation step taken care of, we do get the ability to fully automate patch deployment. So imagine that you have this tool installed in your environment, and as soon as Jamf tells you there's a patch available, this tool just does its thing and starts building the package. And then as soon as the package is available, you can have it set to automatically deploy out to that first test patch policy in your test workflow. And then imagine that you can set it so that after a certain number of days, unless you've come in and hit a big red button that has said, a user called me and something broke, unless that happens, you can set it to automatically advance to your subsequent patch policies, all the way out until you get into production. So we realize that this level of automation is not comfortable for a lot of organizations, but some people really want this. So we'll obviously make this customizable so that you guys can choose the level of automation that's right for you. And then as we talked about earlier, we will be adding support for Apple OS's and App Store apps, as well as additional Jamf source third-party titles. And then finally, this is probably the most common question that I get. Will we allow you guys to write your own definitions for titles that we do not yet support? We have full plans to do that in the future. We just want this a little more ironed out. So what this will do is give you guys the ability to share these things amongst yourself and not have to rely on Jamf to create these titles. Okay, this is the wrong slide, but I'm going to roll with it. So I'm supposed to plug, I have strict orders to plug other sessions, and this is one of the sessions that I'm supposed to plug, but there are a couple others. So there are two instances of a self-service presentation. So if you like what you saw in the keynote and both today, we do have a session that will be going twice that's dedicated to the new self-service app, so definitely go ahead and check that out. And then, like I mentioned, we do have the expert patch session later today. It's at 4 o'clock in the open book, which is just a couple blocks away, and that's with our engineers. And so they can answer any technical questions that you guys have that we'll kind of be skipping over in the Q&A today. So with that, we can go ahead and take some questions from the Twitters.
All right, so bear with me. There's still some tweets coming in, I'm sure, so I'm trying to refresh as often as I can. Now, one of the first questions that came up you actually just answered, which was custom software titles. So we've addressed that. One of the first questions that came up was, is it possible for them to get your awesome t-shirt?
Oh. I had to work pretty hard to get budget for my team's t-shirts, so I'm not sure, but they are pretty cool, right?
All right, and then another question came in on dealing with OS requirements. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand on OS requirements and what do they really need to know about supporting different operating systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we breezed over that definition tab pretty quickly, but if you take a look at a definition tab in a software title, what we're really doing there is we are cataloging everything we know about all the different versions of this software title. So we're looking at things like operating system requirements. Are there apps that have to be closed before we can patch this? Does it require a restart? Do these things have to be installed in order, or can I skip versions? So that's really what is driving the patch policy mechanism to be so smart and to know these things that you guys are used to having to do to figure out manually using our regular policy engine. So we are cataloging the operating system requirements for all these different versions.
All right, there was also a question about what the software titles are. So specifically, Skype for Business, is that included? But I think it would be interesting for people to know, where can they see the list of supported titles?
Yeah, so if you go into your JSS and you enable patch management, there's just a quick checkbox. As soon as you click that new button, you don't actually have to add any if you don't want, but you can see that full list. And then I know that there's also a list in our Casper Suite Administrator's Guide, which needs to be renamed to our Jamf Pro Administrator's Guide.
Very good. There's also a question about notification. So if I recall, you were on a page where you could select JSS, you could select email. Mm-hmm. So if you could tell us a little bit about how that works. Is it per user? Is it per group? How do the notifications work with the patch?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for right now, we designed them to be similar to the way notifications work for smart groups, with the exception of the JSS notification is a little bit new. But I think in your user preferences, you can enable or disable notifications for patch management on a whole. And then, so if I'm someone that cares about patch in my organization, I'd turn those on. If I'm someone that doesn't care about patch in my organization, I'd turn those off. And then within the software titles themselves, you can say, yes, our whole organization, anyone that has patch notifications turned on wants notifications for Chrome. It's a little bit confusing, and we have some improvements that we could make there, but that's how it works now.
Okay. I'm waiting for the list to refresh, so I will actually open it up to members of the audience. So does anyone have a question here? I'll run down.
Drew's going to get his exercise in today.
Yep.
I just called him Drew. His name's Joe. Sorry.
So there's a gentleman here. All right, we'll start with you. You can tell me, and then I'll re-announce it.
In enterprise, we don't deploy the latest version. We deploy the desired version. Are we going to get the option to define the desired version?
Okay, so the question is, in the enterprise, we don't always do the latest version. We do the desired version. So if you could talk a little bit about how we do version control and how you command those versions.
Yeah, this has been a big discussion that we've had with a lot of customers around some of the titles that we already support. The long-term plan for this is to allow you as the IT admin to define what the latest version is. So right now we're using the true latest version down to the last decimal, and we're just counting that as green and nothing else. But in the future, we'd like you to be able to define that for sure.
Very good. Your
Could
question?
you go in a little more in detail what happens when the time has expired?
So the question was, what happens when the time has expired for a user?
Yeah. So we really focused on the self-service distribution method in this demo because we really do think that overall that tends to be the best user experience, but we know that there's situations where you just have to get a patch out, or some organizations just aren't as self-service minded, and so we definitely plan to allow for you to be pushing those out instead of making them available to end users. So when that deadline hits, the experience will be more similar to pushing them out. So we'll still give a little bit of a grace period that you can customize to say, we don't want to just shut everything down immediately when the deadline gets hit, maybe give them like 5 or 10 minutes, but it'll be a little bit more forceful than the self-service workflow. Does that answer the question?
We had another question come in on Twitter about the database impact on the Jamf server with patch. So I think that's maybe more of a question for an expert session. Feel free to follow up. There's a solutions booth as well, and we have some additional discussion forums.
These guys look excited. They're excited to, yep.
And I think we had another question up here. Hands?
Yeah. So I appreciate what you're doing with version 10. Is there any way in the interim to get just a way to take that report and create a smart group out of those ones so that you can easily, so we can use our existing patch management just to have an easy self-service or smart group to deploy that out to?
Okay, so we'll take a stab at this one, so I'll repeat the question for you. So the question was, with the existing reporting and an appreciation of what is coming in 10, in the interim, is there a way to use smart groups, for example, to use the reporting to your advantage and deploy out some of these patches?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now, we do not have plans to be able to generate a smart group from the inventory information that we're using, mostly because we have a mountain of work to do and we're trying to focus on the kind of the future workflows instead of the interim, but I understand the need in the interim. We have done a couple small things to help you out in the interim, not quite that much, but you'll notice that we can actually now for the first time use the less than or greater than operators in smart groups with the titles that we do have cataloged for patch management, as well as Apple operating systems, both iOS and OS X. So that helps a little bit, but not exactly what you're asking for.
All right, and we have another question through the hashtag here. That question is kind of similar to one that was earlier, but will we be able to revert or roll back patches if you wanted to switch versions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we didn't get into that much detail in the patch policy engine yet, but there was a checkbox in there to allow downgrade. The scary part about that for us is that we have not taken the time to test which titles are safe to downgrade. Some titles are safe to downgrade and some are not. So we have some work to do there to figure out how to prevent you from hurting yourselves there.
Okay, and I had a question down. 1 second.
So there's
Very good question. So there's a tab, or there's a way to see what computers are eligible for a patch. And the question is, conversely, is there a way to see those that are not eligible and why they're not eligible?
That's a good question. We do not have that yet. We've talked about it a little bit, but it's not in the current plan.
Okay, another question from the hashtag here on Twitter. Will the functionality be added to close the app for the user from self-service if they need to close it?
That's a really good question. We are definitely open to feedback and discussion on that, I would say, so I like the question. What we're really going for here is to encourage the end user to do as much of this as possible so that we're not shutting things at a bad time and things like that. And so we really liked the idea of trying to encourage them as much as possible to do it themselves, but ultimately being able to control that they have to do it before the patch is installed. So we'd be open to it, but I think right now we're leaning towards encouraging the users to do that.
Okay, and I have another question from Weldon Dodd, again on Twitter. The question is, does self-service use the Mac Notification Center? And I think maybe that's a session that we could address maybe in the self-service, unless you...
Yeah, I think they'll be talking about it in the self-service session a little bit, but the answer is yes. It will be using the native notification center and APNS, so they'll work a little more similar to the notifications that your users are used to.
That's one of the nice things about having a native app with
Yep,
self-service.
absolutely.
And if you do want to know more about self-service, today at 2:45 here is a self-service session, so we can address additional questions about that there. Another question from the floor?
Just wanted to know if the less than greater than is square enough to deal with the non-numerical way of software versions.
Okay. Again, might be a question for one of the more technical sessions, but is the less than or greater than sign, how does that deal with non-numeric version numbers?
Well, no, not non-numeric, but rather the fact that the software is like 10.9 is actually, 10.10 is greater than 10.9.
Yeah, I can answer that. Because we've only implemented that for the titles that we're cataloging the version history for, we don't have to do any string comparison or anything like that. That can get risky and get screwed up. We literally have a list of here's the newest, here's the oldest, and everything in between, and so we just know which is older and which is newer without comparing strings. So there's no risk of screwing that up.
Okay, and another one from Twitter. Will new supported software titles become available automatically, or will a server upgrade be required for patch management titles?
Ooh, that's a great question. So when we clicked new and we saw that list of software titles, where those files are hosted are actually in AWS in the cloud. And so we can make updates to those without you having to upgrade your JSS. So when we add additional titles, you should be able to get that without upgrading your JSS.
Very good question, and I can definitely appreciate all the applause for that because we know that to minimize the amount of upgrades you need to do really helps. Question from down here?
Hey Joe, I was wondering about like a post automatic patch notification. So if you automatically post a patch out, let the user know that something was updated.
Okay, I'll try to get this right, and I might just give you the mic. So post notification, let the user know.
So for an automatic patch update that you just deploy, let the user know something.
So, okay, good. The question is for a patch update that is auto-installed. Are there any plans for us to notify the user that something happened, that they have a version?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now, we've been focusing most of our engineering efforts on the self-service workflow, and the more automatic workflow will come. We just haven't figured all of that out yet. But I know there are requests for actually at least being transparent about what you're doing, even though you're kind of forcing it and doing it fairly automatically. So that's something that we're definitely looking at. Is that what you were getting at? Okay, cool.
All right, very good. For restricted networks, is there documentation for what needs to be open to get the Jamf patching server?
I don't know that there's documentation, but I know support has been getting that question. I don't want to throw support under the bus, but I know they've been getting that question a lot and fielding it gracefully. So I think your Jamf buddy can help you out with that. And I think that Johnny will be getting into that in the expert session. I'm not a networking person. I'm not going to answer that.
Very good. And we really only have time for one more question. I do see a lot of questions here. Some of them do apply to other sessions. So if possible, I will include those in those later sessions for people. But I see one here, and then we'll see if we have time for any others.
So when considering the iterative approach, how might feedback be gathered besides Jamf Nation? Is there, and beyond beta, is there any focus groups for admins to say, like, to get there? How is that process currently, or what do they plan?
Very good. Okay, so this will be the final question because we're running out of time. I want to be mindful of people going out to other sessions and to the lunch breaks. The question is about feedback and the feedback loop. So we obviously have Jamf Nation, great place to go and to share feedback. We also have the beta program. What are some other ways that people can provide feedback for where we're going with the solution?
It's almost like we planted you in the audience because this is a segue into my last slide. So I've been trying to reach out to as many people as possible, but as you can imagine, we have no shortage of patch feedback, so it's hard for me to get to everyone. The first thing I wanted to say, yeah, everyone take pictures. First thing I wanted to say is that we are reading every single word you say about patch on Slack or on Jamf Nation discussions or on Jamf Nation feature requests. We can't physically respond to them all or implement every single thing you guys are suggesting, but we are reading it all. And sometimes it's very distracting from developing, but it's really helpful. So keep doing that. And then I also just want to make sure everyone feels like they have their questions answered and their feedback is heard. So I'm going to take a risk and throw myself to the wolves. And here's my email address and my Slack username. I'm told that @jamf.com doesn't work until Saturday. But Saturday, you can email me at jamf.com.
And for those
StillJamfSoftware.com.
For those who can't read the screen, it's at Miskaek, Miskaek on Slack.
Yes. So a couple different ways you can get feedback to us. We definitely want to hear from you.
All right, with that, we will end the session. There are a number of booths available. If you have additional questions, there's more sessions to come. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful JNUC 2016.